Oh, Castlevania II: Simon's Quest. There's a lot of reputation behind this game, some of it good, a lot of it is really bad, but I would argue that the game isn't bad at all. It was just misunderstood because it changed everything about how the first game worked. And then the angry video game nerd launched his inaugural video, which just evoked memories of this game in millions of people. It just took on its own life of people just having memories of this game and making videos talking about how bad it was. But I think they're chopping out a lot of the memories that they had when they played it for the first time, because it wasn't like any other game on the NES that you had played at that point, and it certainly was nothing like the original Castlevania. So let's shift it back and talk about what the game was intended to do, what it actually did, and what it was actually good at doing. Castlevania 1 was an arcade reflex test. Simon's Quest was an adventure. You aren't just whipping candles, you're talking to NPCs, even if they lie to you from time to time, and discovering new areas in an open world map. The focus shifted very much from survival to discovery. The challenge wasn't just staying alive, it was figuring out where you had to go next and how to get there. The combat took a back seat to the exploration and map. So one of the big things I like to praise about this game is the UI and the inventory system. Unlike Castlevania 1, there's no actual power-ups here. When you die, you don't start back with your weakened whip, you have the whip that you already had. You got permanent upgrades, however, this time. You can upgrade the leather whip to a thorn whip, chain whip, Morning Star, and finally the Flame Whip. There were sub-weapons, similar to the first game, but they had specific uses this time, more than their combat abilities. The Holy Water just wasn't a sub-weapon. It was a tool to find hidden blocks in the floor that you would fall through, and to break blocks in the floor and walls to discover new areas as well. There's also an entire leveling system in this game that's still unknown to a lot of people even to this day. Just like the first Castlevania game, you still collect hearts. Just like the first Castlevania game, hearts are not health. In this game, they're currency, experience, and ammunition, whereas in the first game, they were just ammunition for your sub-weapons. In this game, they had 3 functions. Additionally, the menu system in this game, the inventory, when you pause the game, it's an incredible piece of information giving. Not only do you see the items that you have in your inventory, from your weapons to your sub-weapons to your passive items, but there's also an in-game clock. Instead of a traditional hours, minutes, second clock, it's days, hours, minutes. Because the amount of days that goes by before you beat the game determines your ending. So the faster you beat it, the better the ending you're going to get. The longer you take, the worse the ending. The inventory system actually worked incredibly well. The other piece of key information that's in there is the leveling system. It shows your experience. Now, a lot of people didn't understand where experience was coming from. It actually comes from the hearts. They give a fractional percentage of the amount that you picked up as experience, but only to a certain point. Each area of the game, designated by its respective dungeon, has a level that it can go up to. So as you're headed to the first dungeon, and upon completing it, you can level from 0 to 1, which requires 100 experience points. Once you figure out how many hearts to experience you get, you can kind of farm it. However, once you hit that level for that designated area, you no longer gain experience, so you can't go past level 1 in the first dungeon's area, and the areas leading to it. In fact, the Angry Video Game Nerd, he did one of his Monday plays with him and Mike Matei, and they show Simon leveling up, and he notes in the video, like, yeah, this happens randomly from time to time. You just get all your health back. That was actually Simon leveling up. So when you do get that final piece of experience, the character freezes, your health bar refills and gets larger, you gain more defense, and then the character's kind of blinking on screen to show this. But it doesn't say level up or you've leveled up or any kind of indicator other than that visual cue. But when you pause the game, you'll now see that you are level 01 as opposed to level 0. One of the other things that this game brought in addition to that in-game clock was a day and night cycle. Yes, it was incredibly annoying, especially the first time it happened when you played this game originally. The game completely freezes, The text box pops up with the now infamous "What a horrible night to have a curse." The game fades out, fades back in. It's now appearing to be nighttime. It's darker. Enemies now have more health and they hit harder. Shops and NPCs in the town have all retreated inside, and you can't go inside any of those doors. And the towns are taken over by zombies. The zombies originally were going to hop, very similar to the werewolves, but during playtesting, it was deemed that it was too difficult, and despite Akamatsu's protests, he ended up reducing and taking away that jumping ability. So the big thing with the in-game clock here and that day and night cycle was not to interrupt your gameplay and make the game harder every so often. It was to make you think about how to actually play the game strategically. So during the day, you really want to be in a town, being able to buy items, exchange items, talk to NPCs, and during night, you want to explore as far as you can and get as much experience and money as you could, so that when day came, you could return to a shop and get an item that you previously couldn't. So now you have to actually plan your route, because like I said, the faster you beat the game, the better the ending. So when you start to think of it from that standpoint, how many nights do I want to go by before I beat this game? It makes you really think and plan ahead. And that's exactly how I play the game now. And then you have the dungeons themselves, of which there are 5 plus Dracula's castle. And these are just as cryptic as the rest of the game. There's certain items you get throughout the game, specifically orbs. The first one you get is in the first town. Will reveal certain areas in the dungeon that are not visible. Later on, they'll reveal parts of the map that were not traversable at all, albeit again incredibly cryptic and, in this case, poorly translated. So each mansion had its own look despite them having the same music, but they were all kind of unique with their background look and the maze itself that was inside of it. And the goal of each one of these dungeons was to find an NPC in there that sold wooden stakes. You had to buy a piece of wood from a guy randomly in a dungeon that's holding a piece of Dracula's body. You would buy the stake for 50 hearts, and then as you progress through, you would eventually come to a treasure room that would have a glowing orb on it. You would use your stake as a sub-weapon to shoot and shatter that orb, giving you that specific piece of Vlad. You only got one stake though, so it wasn't like the other sub-weapons that you'll find throughout the game or buy throughout the game. If you shot it in the wrong direction or used it at the wrong time, you had to farm 50 hearts again and you had to go buy another one. Additionally, in this game, only 2 of the dungeons, not including Castlevania itself, have bosses. One of them is Death, who drops a golden knife, but that is a sub-weapon that is similar to the dagger from the previous Castlevania game, but it actually uses hearts as ammunition. It's not really worth using at all because you should really be saving those hearts for purchases and experience. Carmilla is the only boss of the regular dungeons that you actually do need to defeat. She drops the Holy Cross, which allows entrance to Dracula's castle at the end of the game. Death, on the other hand, does not need to be defeated. Saying that, when you walk into the boss room, you can actually just continue walking underneath Death right into the treasure room, shoot the stake at the orb, get your piece of Dracula, walk past him again, and you're out. In fact, if you do decide to stay and fight him and get the golden knife, he respawns anyway after you go and shatter the orb. Same thing with Carmilla. You kill her, you get the cross, you go in and you get your piece of Vlad, you come back, there she is again, but you just continue walking left, and you're right back into the dungeon and you're done and you can leave. I'm not sure if that was an issue with memory on the system or if that was intentional, but it also happens with regular enemies as well in these dungeons, in any area actually, and it makes it incredibly frustrating sometimes. If you move too far left or right, it will respawn enemies, and you can end up getting very large clumps of enemies while you're trying to platform across certain areas, which can make it very unforgiving. That is definitely one of the knocks I can give to this game. In these dungeons as well, you'll want to have a sub-weapon. You'll mostly be using the holy water because it doesn't require any hearts to use. It's unlimited. By throwing these at the floor in dungeons, you can see that there are visible blocks. They look like a regular block, but if you were to walk over it or jump onto it, you fall through. So you can keep throwing holy water to see where they are so that you can jump and avoid them. The other way to find these is to watch the NPCs and the enemies that are walking on screen. They will never walk over the hole in the floor. So you can kind of tell based on their pathing when they stop and turn around where it is. But the game also doesn't want to make it that easy for you either. Sometimes there's 2 blocks. that are false blocks that you could fall through. So it's trial and error if you don't have the holy water and you're just using the NPCs to watch. There's also hidden walls, which again, they look like a regular block wall, but you can jump through them. This is actually key to certain dungeons in finishing them. Bad translation versus the intentional mystery, there is a bit to talk about here. The most notorious one is the Deborah Cliff. Originally, one of the NPCs tells you to hit your head against the wall of Deborah Cliff to make a hole, which makes no sense. However, that NPC was lying to you, because in the Japanese version, she basically says the same thing, headbutt Deborah Cliff to make a hole. Doesn't make any sense. The character is intentionally lying to you. Now, the one that tells the truth, however, is poorly translated. The NPC in the American version says to wait at Deborah Cliff for a soul, but the word for soul and wind in Japanese are the same. It changes only based on the context in which it's being used. The Japanese text actually read, wait at Deborah Cliff for wind. We all famously know now that if you go there with the red orb equipped, and you kneel for a few seconds, a tornado comes and whisks you to that dungeon. Now, the items themselves in this game were all very meticulously picked for very specific purposes. Translation also fell apart here as well. A lot of it was contextual based on the way that they were worded in Japanese and based on certain cultural context that just doesn't translate well without somebody giving contextual background to that. So, in the first town of the game, the major goal there is to buy the white orb, which the game actually starts you off with enough hearts to purchase. It's 50 hearts, but they kind of throw a sneaky in there, and one of the first shops you can go into sells holy water for 50 hearts. Player kind of has to figure out, well, which one do I buy? Your first time playing, you wouldn't think to buy a crystal orb. You would think, well, in the first Castlevania, holy water was by far the best sub-weapon. I should probably buy that. When you leave town now, and you get to your first dungeon, you're probably not going to know what to do, because it looks like an impossible way to get up on that first screen. You'll probably try jumping into the air a few times and then get frustrated and start the game over or just turn it off entirely. But if you would purchase the white orb, you'll see that there's a moving platform. It revealed hidden platforms, although it's just that one in this dungeon. Nonetheless, without it, you wouldn't know it was there. As you progress throughout the game, you'll find other vampire hunters in towns that will want to exchange your orb for one of theirs. The game doesn't ask you if you want to complete this, it simply happens when you talk to that NPC because the original crystal that you just upgraded no longer had a use. So now you have a better one. The second one you get is the blue orb. You'll eventually come across a river in the game that has no way to cross it. You can either turn back, jump into the water and die, and that was it. However, if you equip the blue orb and you kneel at the shoreline, you'll hear a warping noise and then the camera will pan down and now you can actually travel beneath the river. And that brings you to your next dungeon. Later on in the game, you'll find an NPC that's going to upgrade your blue orb to a red orb, which is the one that notoriously brings you to that bad translation / lie of kneeling to get the tornado to whisk you to the next location, to the next dungeon. So each one of these orbs had a very specific use. You can't actually progress throughout the game without collecting all of them. And basically in that order as well. You can't get the red orb if you don't have the blue orb. You wouldn't even be able to get to that NPC. But a lot of this was intentionally cryptic, so that the player was forced to try to figure it out. And again, yes, there were definitely poorly translated NPC hints that made this incredibly difficult to do, especially at the time. There was really no internet to talk to people about it. For me, it was a bunch of my friends and I all would get the game every weekend. We'd either rent it or a couple of us owned it, and you just see how far you can get. Anytime you figure out something new, you'd write it down and you bring it to school each day. After a few months, we finally figured out collectively how to get through this game, which was an amazing breakthrough at the time. Like, it was just awesome. But I don't think any of us actually had the flame whip when we beat it. I think we all just had the chain whip. And that brings me now to the weapon upgrades. It is not apparent in this game that you can upgrade them unless you happen to talk to the NPC that will do it. There are multiple whip upgrades. There's the thorn whip, which is the first upgrade, the chain, the Morning Star, and finally the Flame Whip. All of them you can purchase with the exception of the Flame Whip. The Flame Whip itself is an upgrade you can obtain only if you have the Morning Star. Now, all of these upgrades had a certain cost. You could actually skip the Thorn Whip because you can beat the first 2 dungeons pretty easily without upgrading the whip. This way you could save more of your money to buy the Chain Whip. After you buy the Chain Whip, you'll eventually be able to buy the Morning Star. When you find this NPC later on in the game that's hidden behind a wall in a cave, they'll just upgrade your whip to the Flame Whip. So this game definitely rewarded exploration and trying to figure things out. Even more to that point, when you were in a town, many of the rooms that you would go into expecting a shopkeeper are empty. But the Holy Water and the Sacred Flame, another item you can pick up along the way, can actually break blocks. Your whip cannot, like they could in the first one, so there's no hidden wall meat in this game. So instead in this game, you walk into a shop and there's nobody in it. But if you start throwing the holy water at the ground, sometimes those bricks would break and reveal a staircase. Other times nothing would happen, so you'd walk further to the wall and you'd throw them at the wall. The wall breaks. You can walk into the next room and there's an NPC that sells you an item. This forced you to think about going into every room in every screen and throwing holy water everywhere to see if there were any secrets. There's also no in-game map, and the map that was released in Nintendo Power infamously is just as bad as some of the translations, as they translated the map wrong. So certain areas that Nintendo Power's map would say 2 areas were connected together were often wrong. The better way to do this was to just read the signs in the towns to see which way went where. It wasn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but if you tried to use that Nintendo Power map, it was just going to make things a lot worse. Best way I can kind of explain how the game works is that when it opens, if you go left, the enemies are incredibly difficult, which should be an immediate warning I should not go that way. If you go to the right, everything's much more manageable. For the most part, you go all the way to the right as far as you can until you no longer can progress in that direction, and then you head back, and you're probably now at the point with the items necessary to go left. Some of the other vague, cryptic things that were either mistranslated because of cultural context or just bad translations were the uses of certain Dracula items. Now, each piece of Dracula that you get from these dungeons actually has a use. Dracula's nail actually allows you to use the whip to break blocks. Dracula's rib can be used as a shield to reflect projectiles. When you're standing still, you'll see Simon holding a shield. The game doesn't really explain any of this to you, and it becomes even more cryptic when you get to the ferryman. When you get to the ferryman for the first time, he's going to say, "I can take you someplace good," and laughs. Now, this is not actually the way you want to go. There's an extra item you can get, but it's not required to beat the game by going in this direction. You'll eventually have to go back and take the ferry to where you started, but if you have Dracula's heart equipped, he says he'll take you someplace secret. Now he brings you to the next dungeon. So there's these little nuances like this that highlight the translation issues. But much of this was intended to be intentional for the player to try to figure it out. But other ones were absolutely poor translations, which really made it very difficult to figure out certain aspects of this game. The platforming in this game is pixel perfect, and that is highlighted in several areas throughout the game with not only moving platforms, but platforms that are just instant death when you miss the jump. Notably, there's a river, and on the other side of it, it's an optional item, but there are so many moving blocks to jump over that you'll never get it on the first try. It's just lots and lots of death. But that's one of the other things with this game. Similar to the first, it had unlimited continues, which is great. Downfall is that if you died 3 times and got a continue game over, you lost all of your hearts. Now, you wouldn't lose any of your inventory items, because that would just be brutal. Instead, you lost all of your hearts. Now, this could be equally soul-crushing, because your hearts are also your experience. So if you were close to leveling up, well, now you're starting back at 0. If you were farming hearts to buy your next weapon upgrade, now you're back at 0. Additionally, there's 2 items in the game that can be purchased that aren't necessarily required, but will greatly help out. Garlic and laurels. Garlic can be used to damage enemies, but that's not really why you want to buy it. There are 2 cemeteries where it will spawn 2 NPCs that have an optional item. The other item, the laurels, make you invincible for 6 seconds. Now, when you're playing the game, if you're not going to go through the leveling up system and you just kind of want to get through it, you're going to need those laurels. There are certain poisonous swamps that you have to traverse through that you will die if you're walking through them. So you very much need those laurels to give those 6 seconds of invincibility. For all the faults and crypticness of this game, it still was a pioneer. It basically started the Metroidvania games before that was even a thought. In fact, if this game never released, there's a good chance that the director and creator of Rondo of Blood wouldn't have thought outside of the box to make alternate routes, which means we never would have gotten Symphony of the Night, as the director of Rondo of Blood would go on to start that project before handing it off to assistant director Igarashi, who ended up going with the entire exploration route tenfold. So Igarashi actually wasn't trying to emulate Super Metroid by adding in the map and the exploration. He was actually trying to emulate The Legend of Zelda for its open world exploration. Conversely, Simon's Quest was not influenced by the original Metroid trying to emulate it. Instead, it was another game by Konami for the MSX, a system that never released here, called The Maze of Gallius, which had your adventurer going through a similar open world environment, collecting items to progress further in the game. It tried to do too much. Between the day and night cycle, the RPG stats, the non-linear open world, it was on hardware that just couldn't handle and create the vision that Akamatsu had in his head. But it still came out a very flawed masterpiece. And it's some of those flaws that make this game so endearing. When there's more enemies than the system can handle on screen at once, it slows down to a crawl, almost like you're watching a slideshow. But there's just still something about that doesn't really throw it off or make it any worse for it. That could be because back then, almost every game had slowdown like this. It was almost expected. No one really thought about hardware limitations and why it was happening. It was just you knew the game was slowing down. Almost like bullet time before bullet time. Enemies respawning when the screen moved too far left and right was definitely another point of contention, as you can get stuck in areas that were just flooded with enemies, especially ones that flew in awkward patterns, like the eyeballs and the bats. If you're on a skinny block for platforming, you're gonna die if you let too many spawn. At the end of the day, I think Simon's Quest is just a fantastic entry in the series because it tried something so radically different, and it didn't fail. It didn't necessarily succeed in the way that it's looked back on without controversy, but it succeeded in a way that opened up game development for other developers to try new things and ways to express their games. The same can be said about Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link. Nobody expected that sequel to be a side-scroller like it was. But once you get over that fact that it's not going to just be a repeat of the first game, there's a lot there to love. But these weren't necessarily things you thought about when you would first play these games, especially after you had been waiting so long for a sequel. You weren't expecting something completely different. But when you got it and you sat down and you thought about it, it started to make a bit more sense, and you understood that this was just a different game using those characters, telling it from another perspective. As a kid, that was hard to swallow, but ultimately I ended up really enjoying this game, and now I can kind of go through it pretty quickly because I have it kind of memorized. And that's kind of how they wanted things to play out. Again, Nintendo games were not notoriously long because they're limited by how much they can put onto a cartridge. This game was able to make itself much longer by being cryptic and forcing the player to think way outside the box. But once you memorized it, you can now go through it quickly. And that's why they had 3 different endings. And for that, I applaud them for it, I really do. And it's still a better game than Super Castlevania IV, which just regressed instead of progressed.